So good afternoon and welcome to the second webinar of the series Diversity Matters, hosted by the Migration and Diversities Research Group within Eurac Research. The webinar series explores the impact of migrations, diversities, and mobilities, taking an interdisciplinary approach that bridges the expertise and perspectives of the different institutes that within Eurac Research deal with the topic of migration. So I'm therefore particularly happy to introduce the topic of today's webinar and our distinguished guest speakers that successfully connect the thematic of migration with rural development studies, labor market issues, and social justice. We will explore this interdisciplinary perspective thanks to our distinguished guests of today, Domenica Farinella and Michele Nori, that I warmly welcome, and that I want to thank for their availability to present us and discuss with us the results of their researches. They will lead us through the contents of their recent book, Migration, Agriculture and Rural Development. I will be introducing them shortly, along with a few words about the book. But first, a short introduction of myself. So my name is Marzia Bona. I'm a researcher at the Eurac Institute for Regional Development. I have a background in political sciences, and at the moment I'm focusing on migration processes, internal, international, temporary, and cyclical to rural areas and their social impacts. So the topic is very interesting for me, and I really look forward for your presentation. Welcome as well to the participants, to the public of our webinar. You are warmly invited to take an active role in this webinar by posing your questions to our guests at the end of their presentation. You will be able to do so using the Q&A session. So please don't use the chat, which I think is even not available, but there is an opposite function for this, for you to input your questions, comment at the end of the presentation. So finally, let me properly introduce our guests. Domenica Farinella is lecturer in economic sociology and sociology of globalization at Messina University, Italy. She holds a PhD in sociology of innovation processes from the University of Naples, Federico II. Her recent topics of research include rural and local studies with a focus on changes in pastoralism, multifunctionality in agriculture, new peasantries, informal economy, and the Southern Italy question. In the last years, she has been conducting ethnographic research in sheep dairy value chains and changes in Sardinian pastoralism, and she explored as well the role of welfare systems in rural areas. Michele Nori is based at the Global Governance Programs of the European University Institute in Florence. He is a tropical agronomist, has educational background. He holds a PhD in rural sociology and has worked extensively in pastoral areas of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean region. He has recently completed a Marie Curie Fellowship investigating the role of immigrant shepherds for the sustainability of pastoral systems in Mediterranean EU countries, and is currently engaged in the Pastoralism project funded by the European Research Council, which studies the interfaces among pastoralism, resilience, and uncertainty. I hope I didn't miss important details of your very long and articulated curricula. Just a few words about the book before giving the stage to you for your presentations. So the book, Migration, Agriculture and Rural Development, was published in 2020 by Springer, and it's an open access book. So immediately after my introduction, I will share with you the link through which you can access to the entire volume. It is published within the series coordinated by IMISCO, which is Europe's largest research network on migration. It's the result of extensive research that the two authors have conducted on these subjects since 2014, and it discusses in particular foreign presence in the rural areas of the Mediterranean Europe, namely Italy, Spain, and Greece, and its relation with and the relation between foreign presence and local development. What I find particularly interesting and remarkable in this book is that it adopts a regional perspective, delving into the specific dynamics and processes of change in the agricultural system of Italy, Greece, and Spain, but at the same time, it connects these local processes with global ones. So I quote the introduction that is very telling in that it says that contemporary migrations from and to rural areas are to be analyzed in relation to the incorporation of agrarian system into global markets, agricultural governance, and local territories struggles between innovation and resilience. So I really appreciate this successful attempt at connecting the local perspective with the global dynamics. And I think this is one of the ingredients that makes the book so successful in offering a very balanced pictures of the opportunities and constraints that rural spaces offer for migrant individuals and groups. So the last note I would like to share before giving stage to our speakers is the focus that the book establishes on a picture of reciprocity. So the rural world can provide important livelihood opportunities for immigrant communities, but we should bear in mind that immigrants are at the same time key actors for the resilience of rural areas. They can play a key role in maintaining, reproducing local societies and their heritage. And last but not least, we should perhaps embrace a new perspective and stop looking at the immigrant communities just as workers, but framing them also as potential future citizens of rural areas. So having said this, just a few words about the structure of the webinar. We will now leave the stage to the first part of the presentation by Domenica, Farinella, and then we will leave the floor to Michele and Nori. Their presentation will last approximately 20 minutes each. And after that, there will be room for discussion. So to all our listeners, please take note of your comment and questions for our guest speakers and share them through the Q&A function of Zoom at the end or even during the session. We will take them, we will take note of them and share them with the speakers at the end of their presentation. Thank you. And Domenica, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just a moment. Okay. Okay, now you can see my...
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for this kind invitation. In this presentation is inspired by the book Immigration, Agriculture and Rural Development that I wrote together with Michele and Nori, published for Spring Arena Open Access. In recent decades, migrants have been increasingly present in Western rural areas. In the Mediterranean, they represent 40% of agricultural labor force and are essential both in the intensive farming system typical of lowland areas and in marginal and mountainous regions where agriculture is extensive and agro-pastoral system is prevalent. Okay, why we speak, why the focus is on the Mediterranean European region? Because from the past until today, the Mediterranean area is one of the most important agrarian regions of Europe and also a place of migration. That means this region was simultaneously an area of immigration, and also a transit for immigrants. Our work is an introductory book for students and practitioners, which has two aims. First is to analyze the role of immigrant workers also in marginal and inner setting, while most of the existing research focuses only on the intensive lowland agricultural farming system. And this is the point that Michele will explore. The second aim of the book is to analyze the growth of immigrants in European rural areas as multiple effects of three different and twisted pushes. First, agricultural modernization. Second, the restructuring of the agri-food chain in global markets. So it's called in literature the emergence of the neoliberal corporate model of agri-food. And third, the institutionalization of the agrarian world. That means the role of policies and, in the case of the European Union, the role of the common agricultural policies. In this presentation, for me, it's impossible to expose also these 50 points, but if there is some question, I'm able to, I can reply. So, in my presentation, I want to show how migration in the Mediterranean rural region is affected by these three different pushes. Okay, first of all, modernization paradigm in agriculture. What is? Since the fight in agricultural modernization, it's a strong trend toward industrialization, market-oriented, to increase the production and reduce the costs. Agricultural modernization is finally the application of scientific principle and technological innovations to agricultural activity, making them rational, replicable, predictable, and efficient. What are the components of agricultural modernization issues? First of all, intensification and scale enlargement. Second, specialization within some sector, okay, and also with this doesn't mean also monoculture instead of polyculture. Standardization, replicability, large scale and mass production, mechanization, electrification and irrigation. Commodification of goods, of food. That means that food become a commodity that can be exchanged in with a price in a market. And but also other important point of modernization paradigm in agriculture is that increase the dependence by technologies and industrial inputs for farmers, and also the high trust in the expert system as chemistry to control the nature. The idea that nature can be controlled and also using the technology, chemicals, fertilizer, does mean genetic selection, hybrid seed, but also modernization paradigm push also in social measure. Does mean land reform and privatization, or introduce loans in the agriculture, and the idea that farmer need to become a rational entrepreneur, producing cheap food for the market with high productivity. So the idea that the peasant and also the tacit knowledge linked to the peasant, it was very negative, and also expression of underdevelopment. Okay, there is many stages of agricultural modernization, because the first stage is linked to the idea of mechanization and also the introduction of chemical. The second stage, it's that starting from 17, is linked to the introduction of biotechnology, genetics, and finally, today there is a third stage, a new green revolution linked to this idea of robotization, artificial intelligence, the idea that agriculture, we can have a new knowledge-based agriculture oriented to informatization, renewable energy, biotechnologies, and also the all stuff that high-tech revolution can give to support the improvement of productivity in agriculture. This is the idea is the new form of the current modernization, on the new current modernization that many others call it the new green revolution, is rethinking development within sustainability, but many critical researchers say that these new policies are only greenwashing policies. So linked to the negative, the modernization policies had many negative effects, but the negative effect of agricultural modernization were amplified at the beginning of the 19th, when there is the restructuring of agri-food chain in the global market that created an unbalancing market and increased the power of large corporations through process of unfair liberalization. So the restructuring of agri-food chain in the global market, it's called, for example, from Michael and Friedman, but also other researchers, neoliberal corporate food regime. Van der Ploeg say that is food empire. What does it mean? What is the feature of this new process linked to the modernization policies? First of all, the incorporation of agricultural production in vertical food chain, in global vertical food chain, controlled by transnational corporations. The second is the transformation from producer-driven to buyer-driven food chains, and also the consolidation of retailer power through the supermarket revolution. Okay, another aspect is the financialization of agricultural process that reshape the connection between global north and global south. Finally, the new global agri-food chain, neoliberal agri-food chain, create growing dependencies for farmers, and a vertical integration within value chain under control of monopolistic power. In particular, the transnational corporation in food processing, the transnational corporation are in food processing and also in retail moment, and they dispossess producer because they can intermediate all relation in the market, and there is an asymmetric power, an entire distribution of risk, costs, and profit along the food chain, because food industries and retails use their oligopolistic power of negotiation to impose price and contractual condition on farmers. And also another very negative point is the fact that transnational corporation. It's very big, it's very influenced. So they influence national policies, pushing toward liberalization that consolidates their power, both in developing countries and also in advanced economies. So what is the negative effect of modernization and the neoliberal global agri-food chain for farmers, but also for consumers? The first is loss of autonomy, the increase of degree of commoditization. Loss of autonomy for farmers does mean increase of dependencies for the output and for the inputs, because for the output it's linked to the degree of commodification. All the stuff that you produce need to be sold in a market in which farmer doesn't control anything and can't impose a price. Okay, and the dependencies for the input is linked to the fact that the farmers become more dependent from chemical, from technology, from they need to buy all of resources that is essential to the production. So this loss of autonomy for Van der Ploeg create the phenomena that's called squeeze on agriculture. That doesn't mean the difference between gross value of the production and costs. Okay, that means that gross value production is in stagnation and decline, while the costs increase and the price of commodities on the market are unstable. This loss of autonomy caused a decline of farm number and also a decline of employment opportunities in agriculture, and also a rural exodus. That doesn't mean abandonment of mountain and marginal areas where it's impossible to apply the modernization policies. These also signify a loss of many local culture and also an increase of regional disparities, inequalities. Another negative aspect of modernization and neoliberal global agri-food chain is an increase of pollution, the loss of biodiversity, the loss of food sovereignty, and because in the long supply chain with many intermediaries, there is a breakdown of the relationship between producer and consumer. So the loss of control over food is the same for producer, but also for final consumer. This context creates an irresponsible and untenable agriculture that finally create the negative effect of the increase of migration, the exploitation of immigrant labor in agriculture. Okay, I want to go because I don't know the time. How many time I have?
5 to 7 minutes approximately.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I go very very fast to the part of immigrants and migration, but I want only to say that policies, institutional, the negative effect in some cases of policies, because in many cases, national and also European policies, also if the rhetoric is the idea of rural development and agricultural multifunctionality and peasant support to peasant model and stuff like this. Finally, many of policies that are made by European Union and also by the states favoring concentration process and large agri-food corporation. And so this is ambiguous. There is an ambiguity of policies level, of policies in general, also with regard to the immigrant people that are considered only worker and not person in many cases. So why in recent decades the immigrant workforce in Mediterranean agriculture are increased? First of all, there is the modernization policies pushed for the progressive rural exodus of local population. So in rural area, in European rural areas, we can see a decline of demographic decline and also an aging of people. And second is also the second reason that explain the growth of migration is the decline and the instability of agricultural price due to the global competition that make agricultural work less and less attractive for local population, because the agricultural work is tiring and poorly paid. Farmers are increasingly squeezed by price competition and pushed toward consistent cuts in production costs, which leads them to hire a cheap, seasonal and flexible labor through an immigrant workforce. So we can see in this graph how there is in the last decades this increase of aging, but also increase of international stock of migrants in rural areas. What they do, what the immigrants do in where are in the Mediterranean area the immigrants? They are our picture show you the immigrants work both in industrial and commercial agriculture, that is the intensive system for linked to harvesting in fruit and horticulture. Okay, this is a place in which immigrants work, but also they work in livestock farm that are in extensive agro-pastoralism system in inner and mountain region. So due to its characteristic feature, seasonality, high intensity, manuality, low skilled, mobility, agriculture in Mediterranean Europe represents an entry sector into the local labor market, but is also an entry sector for immigrants, but it's also a transit sector, because if they can, they leave. because in this context, in the idea that agricultural with is informality, it's an entry sector, for immigrant people. Also, the labor market is agricultural labor market is segmented with different migrant groups competing with each other and with local workers. That means that there are many competition and many segmentation in local agricultural labor market, and also in some period there is a sort of replacement from some community that live and other immigrants arrive. Okay, and this is an interesting point of migration in rural area. And also the second interesting point is also the circularity of migration. What does mean circularity of migration? That immigrant people move from a countryside to another countryside, linked to the different harvesting period. For example, during winter, there is the harvest of olives, and for example, in spring, there is the harvest of vegetable and fruit. And they move from Italy to from the south to the north of Italy, from the Italy to Spain or to Greece, and so this circular mobility is interesting, and also the idea that in some cases for Eastern immigrants like Romanian, Albanian, they can also came back often to their country because why? Because there is many ambivalence of contemporary agricultural migration in European rural area. What are these ambivalences? The ambivalences are at three different levels: for local community, for immigrants, and also at the level of national policies. What does mean? For local community, rural immigrants are often viewed in a functional role. They are only immigrants. Just a moment. Immigrants are only seen as a seasonal agricultural worker to be exploited, but they can be also new citizens. They can be also new citizens that can revitalizing the rural world. However, the informal feature of agricultural work might represent critical constraints to integration of immigrant workers in the immigrant people, not only workers, in the agrarian world, because the informality is a big constraint to the integration. And also for immigrants, there is many ambivalence and contradiction. Why? Because in one end, the rural area represents a favorable environment to access livelihood, to access to resources for livelihood, but in the same also rural area with this degree of non-visibility and informality can for an immigrant that arrived in a new state, in a new region, can be a place of opportunity to accommodate need when you arrive, but in this sense, agriculture is a labor niche, providing immigrants with better access to affordable. But on the other hand, this informality, this non-visibility is also a point of a very negative point, because the immigrant is exposed to illegal labor practice and situation of harsh exploitation. And finally, to the level of national policy, also the national policies of main European countries are ambiguous with regard to exploitation and of migrant workers. Why? Because the national state have an high tolerance of informal work in agriculture, especially during the period in which there is high labor demand, and informality is tolerated, and also the national labor policies, it's oriented also only to favor local farm rather their immigrant worker, and the policies create a sort of dualism between farmer and worker, because they incentive they incentive farmer to exploit worker, increasing with a lack of control, because there is this high tolerability to the informality. But also, and they tolerate also, they also push to a functional vision of immigrants, because for example, with policy, with quota policies. Okay, and I finished my time, I think.
Yeah, if you can sum up in 1 minute or so, then we can go back to some relevant points during the Q&A session.
I will finish in a few minutes. Yes. So, what are the rights at stake in these cases? There is many studies that report the informal relationship in agricultural labor markets, but also the precarious living and working condition. That means low wage, high workload, suboptimal working, but also the systemic denial of basic rights, because people work for 10 or 12 hours a day, but also the absence of inclusive policies, because in most agriculture intensive area, immigrant workers live in rural slum called ghetto economy, segregated from local population, and this generated negative effects with recurrent episodes of violence and racism. But also the other negative aspect is unhealthy working condition, because they are exposed to chemical, pesticides and fertilizers when they are far from working fields. Also, the conditions for mobility are very precarious and also dangerous, with many incidents in the countryside, because the car is not good. And but I want to finish my presentation with a positive note, because finally, if national policies and also the local community don't recognize immigrants as citizens that need to be rights, social and other and political rights, and also labor rights. There is many experience that grow up from civil society and implementing the bottom-up practices of integration and cooperation. For example, in the Italian case, SOS Rosarno, Contadinazioni, Tutta Zero, and other similar experience in which the immigrant people can be integrated in local community and also work together with farmer, activists, and precarious worker to contrast this exploitation and to struggle also for a fair price for food and the possibility that food are not become not only a commodity but also a very important aspect of social life. Finally, okay, I finish. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Domenica, and thank you for providing this positive note and direction for imagining potential exit strategies from the situation, which is in general terms of exploitation. So we need to be aware that alternatives exist. They are not mainstream yet, but we can certainly contribute making them mainstream through our daily choices and discourses. And having said this, I would now invite Michele to turn on his camera, and please, the floor is yours for the second part.
Yes, thanks a lot to Domenica for this overall and comprehensive introduction. I now have to try to share my screen so that I can try to bring you to, you see that?
Yes, we see it.
Is it visible? Okay.
Yeah, can you make it just presentation mode so we see it bigger?
I am.
Yeah.
So the idea of the second part of the presentation is to bring all these concepts that Domenica has introduced to us to the ground in a very specific setting, that is the one of pastoralism, that is extensive livestock breeding that very often takes place in mountainous areas, in islands, in drylands, so in areas where more intensive agriculture is not feasible. So this is part of the Pastoralism project, as it was mentioned before in the introduction, and is a project that looks into pastoralism in different regions of the world and look at the uncertainties that characterize them and the strategies that have been undertaken in order to cope with those uncertainties. As Domenica told us, there is this dualism between immigrant workforce representing a very critical asset for the resilience of agriculture and the rural world, and at the same time, agriculture and the rural world that provide important opportunities, entry points, as it has been said, to migrants to start finding a job, some form of housing and a kind of livelihood because of the informality and the limited control in this in the rural settings. Some figures that have been mentioned in southern EU, in the Mediterranean EU, that is called here EU Med, is about 40% of the salaried workforce in agriculture is composed by immigrants. This is the official data, so it might be much higher, whereas in other countries or in other regions of the world, such as US, UK, and Canada, is about 2/3 workers in agriculture. I mean workers, not farmers. So those that do the physical work are coming very often from another country, so they can be defined as immigrants. And as we can see in the chart here, we see how this has been increasing in the last 20 years. This is the case of Italy. So it's definitely a very important process that is still ongoing at very, very high rates. And this takes place, as has been shown in the last pictures as well by Domenica, in whatever sector in agriculture, from strawberry picking to tomato collection to more marginal, let's say, to sectors that are undertaken in more marginal settings, such as forestry and livestock keeping. And what is interesting is that we mostly find an immigrant workforce that is more intense on the two extremes of the farming system range, the very intensive ones and the very extensive ones. Pastoralism, by definition, is extensive system, meaning that is more labor intensive rather than capital intensive, because it requires people to look after the animals to go around and graze in pasture lands. This is the Mediterranean, and you can see how many mountainous areas and islands we have, and these are very often characterized by extensive livestock production system. Just to give you a brief glance, the main cheese in Spain is the Manchego. In Italy, one of the most important one is the Pecorino Romano, and in Greece is the Feta. And these three cheeses, they are all produced through ewes or sheep milk that is very often produced through extensive livestock systems. So it's not just an issue of marginal landscape and territories, but it's also part of the local culture and the national economy. Three main domains that in pastoralism we use to define how uncertainties have been reconfiguring pastoralism in the different regions. And when it comes to Mediterranean Europe, these three domains are environmental, market-related, and policy-related. When it comes to Mediterranean Europe, we can see, we can talk about, when it comes to the environment, climate change on the one hand, as we've seen in the recent years, abandonment of the rural settings and the population in rural communities, the increasing presence and the cohabitation with wildlife and predators that characterize most marginal and mountainous areas. When it comes to, so I can show a picture here about what it means, having to live in areas increasingly populated by wolves and bears because of European engagement on biodiversity. This means that the life of pastoralists, of shepherds, have been changing quite consistently because they have to take care of the animals to a much higher degree than they used to do before. Market-related uncertainties, until about 150 years ago, throughout the Middle Age, it was the wool that was the main asset of the pastoral economy and of the regional economy. Wool production and commercial and trade was the key asset of the transhuman system and the Middle Age economy throughout Southern Europe. Then we've gone through 150 years of animal proteins being the main product supplied by pastoral systems, meaning milk and meat, basically lambs and cheese, more popular products. And then, well, let's say that recently there has been a shift from pure products, wool and proteins, to services that are called socio and ecosystem services. We will see them later on because of new demands of society. So society is changing. There is less requirement for animal products or different requirements for animal products. There are more demands for environmental services. So the role and the importance of pastoralism, the role and relevance of pastoralism in society is also changing. This also implies that that pastoralists have to change their way of producing and providing, as well as providing services. They also have to take into account trade agreements and the volatility of into the markets of their products. We have a case here of sheep milk in Lazio, Sardinia, and Tuscany, central Italy, and you can see how volatile this price is. So they have to deal with this kind of uncertainty that is related to the increasing engagement with market dynamics as it has been exposed by Domenica. And then overall growing production costs, the issue of squeezing that she's been mentioning, and international competition from other countries, other regions, such as New Zealand and Australia and the UK nowadays in Europe. And then the last domain is the one of that has been mentioned as well by Domenica, policy related. In the last 40 years, there have been quite consistent financial, budgetary cuts into inner areas and mountainous settings. So very simple example are the post office that have been shut down, primary schools are maybe surviving, but secondary school, no way. So inner mountainous and island communities, they've been losing ground in terms of their rights and their capacity to access basic services. Then the reforms of the common agricultural policy have also carried major changes in the life as well as in the work of pastoralists. We talk about less favored areas, high nature value, habitat program, Nature 2000 leader program, biodiversity engagement. So the life of pastoralists have been changing quite consistently, as we mentioned, because they are not just understood and perceived as producers of animal proteins, but increasingly as providers of ecosystem services. And just to say that as an average, the money coming from the common agriculture policy are about 50% of the revenue of pastoral farmers. So this also creates a high degree of dependency on the policy setting. Another word that has been mentioned by Domenica. And then overall in the policy setting, the trade engagement and the environmental convention the EU has been signing, such as the protection of wildlife and predators that are changing the life and the work of pastoralists, as we have seen. Here, just briefly, we can see how the main reforms of the EU common agriculture policy in the last 2 decades that have been quite consistent. And the idea of the common agriculture policy nowadays is to somehow reward and compensate people that produce in difficult areas or that produce by taking into account environmental externalities. And so they have higher production costs. And so the idea is to remunerate those kind of difficulties as well as the gap into income levels. So what does this all mean? This is the whole process that has also been described somehow by Domenica. What does this mean in practice when it comes to pastoral areas? A deeper reconfiguration of pastoral farming, of the way pastoralists and their families and their flocks live and work. Basically, this has meant a steady and consistent and still ongoing decrease in the number of farms. We can see here for 3 countries that we are analyzing: Italy, Spain, and Greece. From the 90s to up to date, we are losing about 30% of the overall flocks every 10 years. So it's a major loss, not only in physical terms, but also in biodiversity terms. At the same time, what we see is that the average size of the flocks and the herds and the farms that remain in place, they are increasing. So there are less farms with much more animals. This is just to put it very simple. And another process that we are seeing increasingly large farms and small farms, meaning that the middle class of the pastoral farm is somehow disappearing. And this means in general that what we are witnessing is an overall polarization with winners on the one hand and losers on the other of the territories. We have areas that are increasingly utilized and more intensively producing, such as the high agriculture areas that Domenica mentioned, low plains and very accessible to irrigation schemes. Whereas on the other hand, we have the abandonment and the marginalization of mountainous and dryland settings. There is also socio-economic polarization in the sense that, as I mentioned, we are seeing somehow a disappearing of the middle class of farmers. There is as well a polarization in socio-cultural terms, as Domenica mentioned, because we have farmers on the one hand that mostly deal with administrative tasks and burden, looking into ways to get access to the common agriculture policy subsidies, the programs, to be compliant with all the requirements. Whereas on the other hand, in the field with the animals, it's very often another part of the world that takes care of the farm. So there is this dualism between the desk-based work and the field-based work. And there is also generational polarization in that these conditions, definitely they're not very exciting for new generations. And so there is a limited vocation for pastoral shepherding. And this is what brought a major change in the kind of reconfiguration in the workforce. A deep reconfiguration of the pastoral workforce. Some of the statements that we might find in the book: the living conditions of shepherds have not improved, while the working conditions have intensified. More animals, more predators, more risks, more uncertainties. There is a marked separation between the managerial and the field work, as we said. So somebody's working on the desk and somebody else is working with the animals. The earnings have not been increasing because of the increases in the production costs and the reduction in the profits, as Domenica mentioned. And overall, there has been a shift from family labor to waged or salaried labor in the first stage, and secondly, from a local salaried labor to a foreign salaried labor. So the entry of immigrants in the last 20 years is just part of a process where family members have been detaching from the pastoral farm. So very often it's migrants nowadays that take in the field, that take the place of previous local shepherds. They're filling this kind of gap, that is a generational gap somehow. And they are normally appreciated for their endurance, their capacity to work in very hard conditions, their flexibility, and the capacity to adapt. One of the statements that is quite recurrent is that they look like they seem like we've been 60 years ago, so about 2 generations ago, so that they can cope with the hardship of working as a shepherd. There are, when discussing and thinking and talking about their presence into European mountains, we have to take into account that there are socio-cultural and language aspects. Very often they don't talk the local language, so they are definitely somehow marginalized in social relationships, even because they live in quite marginalized settings, such as mountainous areas. They organize themselves through networks to be recruited and to find the information about opportunities and housing and livelihoods. These networks might be at times quite exploitative. The average profile is about men of 25 to 40 years old, very often coming from a rural setting, so they have some kind of exposure or experience to livestock keeping in a way or in another. As mentioned by Domenica, there is a process of group substitution. Initially, these were in Italy, Spain, and Greece, mostly Albanians, Macedonians, and Moroccans. Lately, in the 2000s, it was the Romanians that came in because of the joining of the EU. They had the more capacities in administrative terms to comply with the European laws and rules. And later on, even the Romanians have somehow disappeared from the sector, and there's been a kind of entry into the system of sub-Saharan Africans and Eastern Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indians coming to work into European pastoral systems. The conditions they live in and they work through are quite informal, as it has been stated, very partial rights and very precarious conditions, very often conditions of illegality, limited rights, scarce salary, and poor living and working standards with kind of relevant social costs. It's very difficult to find people with, or it was difficult until a few years ago to find people with a proper insurance system. And this definitely, as we've seen for those flows of Macedonian, Albanians, and Romanians, this leads to a very limited integration of these workers into the local societal setting, and also because of their very scanty perspectives for improvements in socio-economic conditions, meaning that they come as workers and after about 10, 20 years, they are still workers. They don't see a future into farming themselves because there is no mechanism in place to allow this social elevator or scaling up. These are just a few figures about some regions in Abruzzi, Veneto, Epirus, Peloponnesus. The rate, the third column from the left is the rate of, these are very informal figures, but the rate of migrants that cover the percentage of the workforce in pastoral settings. So just to give you an example, in Piemonte is about 70% of the shepherds, those looking after the animals, are of a foreign origin. They are not, as we stated, the owners of the animals, not the owners of the land. They just look after the animal as workers. And we have the same case in France, although to a different extent, Spain, Cyprus, Portugal, and even other countries. This is not new. This kind of generational replacement, so one generation changes and another group comes in, is not new. There are here some flows that have been taking place in the last century. People from northern Italy going to Switzerland, from southern Spain going to the Pyrenees, from the Kurds area going to Anatolia and central and western part of Turkey, as well as in Greece. This has been taking place already. What is changing is that in those times, those families and communities, they engaged, they integrated, they scaled up, and they became eventually local farmers, local entrepreneurs. This is not what we are seeing today. In the case of Italy, we have the very famous, let's say, example of the Sardinians. Here in the middle of the picture, you can see Sardinians that moved in the 50s from the Sardinian island with their animals, with their sheep. They moved to mainland Italy and they colonized the areas that were being abandoned. But they were heavily supported. This is just a list of the mechanisms that the policy setting at the time they put in place, such as subsidy schemes, loan schemes, and rules and regulation that made it possible for those immigrant communities to establish themselves as farmers, as entrepreneurs in the place where they were migrating to. This is not happening nowadays, and this leads to a lack of generational renewal because there is no one taking over from the current shepherds and the current farmers. This is somehow a lose-lose scenario because the immigrants, they don't graduate in socioeconomic terms, and then, as we said, they don't evolve into farmers and entrepreneurs themselves. Elderly farmers and pastoralists, they don't know when they get retired, they don't know to whom they could leave their farm, their lands, their animals, so they're also losing on their side. Society at large is losing because we are losing not only the products, high quality products, but also the very relevant services that are provided by pastoralists. Just think about fire events that could be prevented by appropriate grazing of forest areas because you keep the biomass low. Whereas if you don't graze, the dry grass comes high, and then it becomes much more difficult to manage forest fires. Just a simple examples from what we've seen in recent summer times in Italy, Greece, Spain, and everywhere in the Mediterranean. So those ecosystem services are not just nice, they're very important for our society. And we are losing them because we are losing pastoralists. This is taking place despite a huge and very relevant engagement the European Union has undertaken, not only in political, but even in financial terms. About 40% of the overall EU budget goes into agriculture through the Common Agricultural Policy, and with the stated objective of supporting agrarian economics and rural livelihoods, especially in disadvantaged and marginal areas. This is not taking place, so we are having a problem. In the book, you might find even more details, as it has been stated. The point is that coming back to the ambivalence that was mentioned before, the agriculture sector and the rural areas might provide and they do, indeed, in these times it's been demonstrated, they do provide a proper setting for a proper entry sector and world for migrants that arrive to Europe. And also because it's consistent maybe with with the background of most of the people coming, because they might come from a kind of rural background. So they might find an entry point into European agriculture to find a job, to find a house, to find a place to live, and the place to work. So this is good. At the same time, the gray conditions under which they operate make this sector quite non-enjoyable in the longer term, because they see very limited opportunities for improving their socioeconomic conditions and to upscale their managerial capacities. So the grayness that characterize the rural world in Europe is providing opportunities as well as challenges, because it enables people to join some kind of activity, but they don't find the opportunity to evolve. So they move out, and what we remain with is a rural world that is suffering high degrees of abandonment and depopulation. And I think when it comes, and I conclude here with the policymakers and the overall policy frame, this has to be redressed, because we are spending a lot of money on mechanisms that apparently are not consistent. The money is not going in the right direction, and what we've seen in the last 30 years is a steady decrease, as we've seen, of pastoral farming and the related socio-cultural and economic advantages that the society might engage. So generational renewal, revitalization of the rural world, more sustainable agricultural system, this is what we are talking about. and this needs a more adequate policy framework, including the common agricultural policy. Thank you a lot for your attention. I hope I didn't go too far and too much in timing.
No, we are perfectly on time. Thank you, Michele, for your presentation, and to both of you for providing such comprehensive and complementary perspectives on the work you have presented in the book. Lot of ideas and questions, but I would first of all ask our public to let us know if they have comments or questions to share with you. You can use the Q&A form that is at the bottom of the Zoom window. We can give them a few seconds, but if not, I can start. No, there's something? Not yet. If not, I would be gladly start and break the ice with questions, picking some of the points, of the many interesting points you have presented to us. One of the points that makes this volume very original is your perspective on extensive agriculture, and because we know very much what's wrong with intensive production. I mean, we have access to information about that, but the attention is much less intense on extensive agriculture, including pastoralist practices. So I'm wondering whether you have noticed, whether you could detect a different room for migrants agency in these two types of contexts. So we know the blackmailing and the harsh conditions that are one of the main features of migrants' involvement in intensive agricultural production, but is there room for more negotiation and voice by migrants when they are engaged in this sort of extensive agricultural production? This would be a first point for discussion. Yeah.
If I would like to give interesting question. Okay, it's when foreign shepherd work, they are alone in the countryside, and the only contact that there is with the farmer. In some cases, also the hard condition of farmer create a sort of apparent equality in work, and so the degree of exploitation is more difficult to see finally in this context, because it's a context very poor also for farmer, for shepherd, for local shepherd. And the things that I note, it's finally that the agency in intensive agricultural context are stimulated by the contact, by the fact that the immigrants share the same field and also the same place for living, and so it's like it's possible that they develop a sort of class conscience, awareness. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. But in the case of pastoralism, what is the possibility to agency? Finally, in our research, we note that they have the foreign shepherd have an agency, big agency. Finally, also if they are subalternized, they try to create a new narrative on them, and also the main way in which they use the agency is to live. This is the extreme way to exercise the agency, to live without any. So, for example, when I make many interview with Sardinian shepherds, they say, they are not very good workers because they can live in a way without any notice before. But this is a way in which they demonstrate their agency. Another way is also in the everyday practice that they made, because it's a continuous struggle with and negotiation with the shepherd to have some space of freedom, because the shepherd wants to exercise a power of control in deciding what he needs to eat, for example, where the time of the timing in the workload, the stuff like this. But the foreign shepherd try to create a sort of freedom in the way which won't manage the work. And this is interesting. It's a very interesting point. But there is no trade unions, no possibility to create a collective movement, in my opinion. This is a negative point, perhaps.
Michele, thanks, Domenica. And it's this living as an option to exercise agency. It's a very interesting point, because I also detected this from the side of farmers. It's very often indicated as an attitude that migrant workers have, and that breaks the narrative of the good worker. No, they just live as if they are living the best job ever. No, the job that would have provided them with the perfect life perspective, and inexplicably they live. So there is this tendency to not accept as an option that a person can exercise his or her agency and living a job which is not satisfactory enough. So it's a point that would be nice to discuss further with you. Michele, do you want to add something? And then we have a question from Cristina Dalla Torre from the public. So Michele, please.
Add something on this, because what we see through in different ways, but this is also happening with the young people that are the sons or the daughters of the farmers. Very often they leave because they see they will never manage the farm until the parents will be there. So that kind of living that is much more gentle in family settings is the same. So the farming dimension is so embedding somehow that as I said, the workers don't see a space for the future into the farm, but even very often the sons and the daughters, they don't see their space in the farm. So it's a process that is taking place at different levels. And on the one hand, we can help by producing and engaging with a policy setting that is more inclusive, definitely. But on the other hand, it's a problem of the sector, in the sense that it's difficult for people to accept that somebody else, a newcomer with a different knowledge or different skills or capacities or dreams, can contribute somehow their agency to the farming system. So that kind of agency that is somehow constrained is at all levels. And this is a problem maybe that we should address more broadly for the farming sector more in general.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm sharing with you the question that Cristina Dalla Torre posted in the Q&A. Thank you for your presentation and your articulated critics to the common agricultural policy, allocating funds not in line with the stated goals, and eventually contributing to intensification, robotization of agriculture, and therefore to increase revenues of big farms. What alternative mechanisms could work for the CAP to allocate the fundings differently, so that they are more equally distributed and have a better impact for rural areas and sustainable resource use? Thanks, Cristina.
Okay, this is a very difficult question, because I note in general that there is a contradiction between the different policies that European Union made, because in one hand they support retail and large scale distribution, and in another they say we need to adopt a post-productivist approach, and imagining that in a rural area we need to have rural development linked to the multifunctionality, linked to the idea that the farmer is also a sort of guardian for local tradition, local culture, and tacit knowledge that are specific that are linked to the specific place. But in fact, many of the things that European Union approach are don't permit for to have don't pay attention to the peasant agriculture finally. So what does mean? The idea that there is in some cases the production for self-consumption, or also for little scale consumption. And so it's also artisanal production. It's impossible that to be adequated to big standard or certification. So the first important things that we need to have at level European level is the allow for peasant agriculture, to define what is peasant agriculture and what is peasant agriculture as a mode of production, okay, and also have some exception for the way in which they can produce, for the way in which they can sell, because it's impossible also for the law about healthy and sell, for example, if you want to kill an animal in your farm, it's impossible to do this because you are in an illegal level. So we need some measure to support really the peasant. I think that Michele can say other things to support this idea, because we are also in Rete Appia, that is a network for pastoralism with the aim to support this idea of peasant mode of production.
Yeah, just to mention two main things. One is that pastoralists are the one that in proportion receives.
Michele, I'm sorry, can you make sure the microphone is okay, because we
one key element is that pastoralists are those that receive in proportion less within the common agriculture policy, and they are those that contribute more in terms of environmental externalities, the quality of the food, the welfare of the animals. So definitely there is a kind of not only contradiction, but there's somehow some problem, some conflict of interest between the stated objective of the EU policy and what happens on the ground. So, because most of the money, as we know, go to farms that have huge amounts of land, that have very intensive systems. Most of the money go for in loans and credit system in order to purchase very highly mechanized and sophisticated systems. So definitely the push from the common agricultural policy is for intensification, as it was mentioned even by Domenica. So that is the direction that has been taken since inception by the EU, and it is still there, despite the greening, the environmental, the animal welfare, whatever there. If you look at the recent document, Farm to Fork, that is the new global value chain thinking of the European Union, there's everything that seems very interesting and very much in the right direction, because the whole value chain is somehow critically assessed in order to take into account of the different aspects of sustainability at the different levels, from the farm to the market to the consumption. Then when you look at what has been the reform of the recent, the recent reform of the common agricultural policy, you find that the same principles and mechanisms that used to be there in the last 30 years, they're still there. So money to people that used to grow maize in the Piadura Padana or in the river valleys with high degrees of chemistry and technological inputs, those are still the people that receive money. We are still talking about historical rights for people that used to produce something in 2001. So there's limited room for new generation. There's limited room for more sustainable development. So all these nice principles that the European Commission tries to evolve and develop, they are not incorporated into the reforms of the common agricultural policy. There are some interests that are quite strong and properly defended, I would say, in political terms by the syndicates and the trade unions of the farmers, but so there's no room for change, not much. And at the same time, there's a whole bureaucratic set of multi-level embeddedness that make the whole system quite inconsistent, in the sense that the money enters with one principle in Brussels and ends up on a totally different set of principles on the ground. So the principles are very often not the right ones. The whole administrative machinery of the common agricultural policy, from Brussels to the national level, to the regional and local level, is set in order to defend certain interests that are definitely not those of the peasants. This is why people as pastoralists that make the best possible services in providing healthy and sustainable products through very sustainable systems that take into account the so-called environmental externalities, they are those that receive less.
Domenica?
Sorry, I want to say just another thing. About this contradiction between the rhetoric and the fact, the practical politics. Finally, if we consider organic sector, there is this idea that organic is important for sustainable development, but now the push for organic transition is a push for conventionalization of organic production. Does mean that for the conventionalization and also the standardization, it's the contrary of the things that a peasant, a small producer can do. Okay, because it's impossible for him to, for example, to buy every time the seed, the seed by organic producer of seed. There is many contradictions in these politics. So we need to speak and finally to make pressure to European community, because big corporations have many interests, but also big farmer. Because, for example, in Italy is a typical country where there is an intensive agriculture. So, for example, measures as greening are not seen as a good measure, and they try to stop at community level the greening or other. Also, there is this idea that if you give the payment in the rural area, in the marginal rural area, is subsidies, not like a positive support to help the farmer in to stay in a very hard situation. So this idea that all things are subsidies, and we need to change the mind, and the idea that if you stay in a marginal or mountain area, you are underdeveloped, you are poor, or stuff like this.
There's another question in the same direction that comes from our colleagues from our colleague from Minority Rights Institute, Roberta Medda. Do you think that the recent UN declaration on peasants' rights might help in the direction that you are suggesting in your conclusions? So do you think this is a document that can somehow push in the direction that you were just mentioning? Thank you, Roberta, for your question.
Okay, in my opinion, also in the global peasant movement, there is many pushes. So the final document is, I think that it's good, but can be improved. I don't know if. Because it's the result of a negotiation, finally. Also, yeah. There is many soul in this movement. So, but the idea of agroecology is certain important.
If I may add something to this, I think this is relevant, but maybe more relevant is what is happening at the COP negotiations, the COP negotiations on climate change, and the forthcoming ones on biodiversity and so on, where if we are able to show that peasants' agriculture and sustainable farming systems are those at small scales, local level, and not those based on the neoliberal corporate food regime, as Domenica put it, that's the battle to win, because climate change is evident, environmental degradation is evident, abandonment of rural areas are all processes that are under our eyes, and in our daily life we see that, and we are paying for that. We are paying from the drought, we are paying from the fire, the wildfires in summer. So there are evidences that society is acknowledging that some systems are better than others, and there are ways of producing food and managing natural resources that are definitely the ones that we should pursue in the future. So as we said, the common agricultural policy should go that way, but the whole institutional setting, and we hope that the COP will help into that, should go in the same direction, because if we still believe that just a simple example, UK went out of the EU and is now importing animal products from New Zealand and Australia. If that is the system that we're thinking about, then any other declaration, document, agreement, whatever else make little sense, because if policy directions are going that way, there's no way we can redress the system from the bottom.
Yeah. We are almost close to the end of our time, but I just share with you the last question posed again by Christina that says, thank you for your replies. I have another question related to labor force in agriculture. We have seen in the last years increasing problems with lack of seasonal farmers, workers, or in most cases, forms of caporalato imposing transaction costs both to farmers and workers. Would it be a relevant direction to devote some funding to train seasonal workforce to have a long-term relationship with the farmer, especially for small farmers, so that there is no need for intermediation of a caporale? At which scale, and who should be responsible for such training? Or are there other ways to ensure good quality working relations between farmers and workers?
This is a very difficult question. Thank you so much, because it's a point to reflect. I have no answer finally. I think that the main problem is the chain of production, and also the relationship that there is in supply chain. and not a problem of formation. Because I think that formation perhaps can be addressed to the farmer, not to the agriculture, to the worker, because finally workers are in some cases for harvesting in the things it's very unskilled. In many cases it's unskilled work and don't need many skill, but in many cases, for example, if you need to, for example, for grape wines harvesting, you need to have a certain level of expertise. So, for example, also for the cork, when you cut the cork, okay, you need to have a very big level of expertise, but this level of expertise in some cases don't protect the worker from the exploitation. Also, if you are in a rich system as Piedmont, where there is wine that is very important, very high, with high price in the final market, there is exploitation. So there is some things in the system that doesn't work. There is not the formation for workers, I think.
Can I say something on this? Because I think that Christina, she addressed a very, very relevant point, playing at the interface between farm entrepreneurs and the workforce. That is what is missing. And that is, on the one hand, you might talk about training. Training is definitely part of the story, because you might come from a very different country or culture or different techniques. And so you need the skills to do that. My example is that in Tuscany, I'm making use of a cooperative of that has been organized locally, a cooperative of refugees that are helping into the pruning and the collection of the olives. Just a very simple example. I can give you the details if you want, but it's very effective because they do well. The alternative is to have abandoned olive trees. So the point is that not so much the technical skills would be relevant, but what civil society could play as a very relevant role is the one of providing the guarantee. So playing the interface in socio-political aspects, in the sense that they take the responsibility of matching the demand with the offer, and playing the socio-political role of guaranteeing on the one hand and the other. So we're not just talking about the technical aspects of training, but playing a much more political kind of role in playing this interface. That is definitely what it is missing, and that is the caporalato are doing that in their own way. There must be a better way to match the demand and the offer, because as we've seen in the UK, the demand is there. So why should people that are highly demanded be so highly exploited? This is the problem. So I think Christina, addressed a very relevant aspect. But there is a technical issue. There is even more a socio-political one, I would say. And by the way, in the Rete Appia, that is this network of people, organization, and farmers that deals with pastoralism in Italy, we are trying to establish pastoral schools with the same exact objective. That is trying to provide technical skills for pastoralism to be modern, because there are techniques that might be improved. And on the other hand, in order to involve as well people into the sector and to give them an idea about what are the rights, what are the duties, what are the requirements. So because being a farmer in a different countries is not just being a farmer anywhere, especially if you have to comply with the common agriculture policy, the local rules, and so many things that you might not be aware of. So through a national school that is called a SNAP, in the Rete Appia, we're trying to fill and bridge somehow that gap by bringing a new workforce into pastoral settings and matching them with the demands from existing farms.
Okay, so thanks to our speakers for answering all questions and providing more stimuli than those that we already got with the presentation of their book. And thank to the public who stood with us until this moment, even if we are 6 minutes late compared to the initial timing. That was a very interesting experience and food for thought, I would say. I just would like to remind to our guests and to the public that there will be a third event of this series of webinars organized by the Migration and Diversity Group that is scheduled for November the 18th at the same timing as of today. And we will be dealing with access to and exclusion from housing over time, migrants' experiences in rural areas, a conversation with Tobias Weidinger and Stefan Korder from the Institute of Geography, University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, Germany. So thank you all, and we'll see you at the next event of this webinar series.